Green Commons today. It's not going to be conventional, it's all going to be some classroom treatment. So after I run the program here this morning, and this is for the Green Commons, we'll remain here at the arena because shortly after this, of course, you're all interested in you're to the Senior Citizen Center here in Durham to partake in the nutrition program.
Thank you, Ben. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. I'm not sure if this is the third or fourth political panel that has been my privilege to moderate. And I can't help feel every time I drive up to Huron for this occasion how fortunate we are in South Dakota to be able to have a panel of this kind. I can't speak for all the 50 states naturally, but if this occasion is not unique, it is certainly one of the few states in the nation that is able to have all of its political candidates here to speak to us in person on a very friendly basis about the issues. I think this is one of the states in the Union where it can truly be said, to use that word which has become almost sententious, we can get politics in South Dakota down to the grassroots level, where we can talk to candidates on a first-name basis and really find out what they think about the issues. And for this, I think we are all indeed fortunate. This morning, we'll be listening to 8 candidates and 1 substitute for Congressman James Abdnor. May I introduce the gentleman starting on my right, Mr. Jack Weiland, who is the Democratic candidate for 2nd District Congress, and sitting beside him, Mr. Frank Denholm, who is the incumbent 1st District Congressman. And next, the Honorable Richard F. Kneip. And I say it only so formally, Dick, because he may recall 2 years ago when one of the classic boners of the Farmers Union Convention occurred when I introduced him. And beside him, of course, is our incumbent Senator George McGovern. Starting at the far end of my left, sitting in for Congressman Abdnor this morning is Mr. Owen Amber. And may I read just one paragraph of a short note that Congressman Abdnor sent. Because of the unexpected reconvening of Congress by the leadership of the House, Jim Abdnor is unable to be with us this morning. He seriously considered missing the session to be here, but a number of issues of great importance to South Dakota may be considered in Washington, and Jim concluded he had better be there. So in his stead is Mr. Owen Amber, the assistant to Congressman Abdnor. Then Larry Pressler, who is the Republican candidate for 1st District Congress in South Dakota. And next, Mr. John Olson, the Republican candidate for governor. And the last gentleman is Mr. Leo Thorsness, the Republican candidate for the United States Senate. This panel this morning will operate as it has in the past. Each of the gentlemen will be allowed 7 minutes to make a statement to you. And following the statements, 7 minutes in duration by each one of the gentlemen here, and incidentally, they're all being timed by this charming lady sitting down in the very front of the auditorium. When their 7 minutes is expired, we expect them to wrap up the sentence on which they are speaking at the moment and take their places again. During the time that the 1st District congressional candidates are making their statements, some pages will go through the audience to collect questions which you might wish to ask of the individual candidates following their formal presentation. Just raise your hand unobtrusively and the pages will come and get the questions. The questions will be sent to a panel sitting behind the curtain here. The questions will be screened, handed to me, and then each candidate will have the opportunity to respond to these questions 3 minutes in length. And if one candidate is given a question to which his opponent takes some exception in terms of an answer, the opponent will be given the opportunity for 3 minutes of response. Those questions will be answered from the positions in which the candidates are sitting. The original 7-minute delivery will be here at the podium. Now, Mr. Chuck Groth and I took the liberty, since the candidates did come in individually, to flip a coin, as is the rule at the Farmers Union Convention, to see which of the candidates for the various offices would speak first or second. We will begin with the U.S. senatorial candidates, and according to the flip of the coin, it was determined that Mr. Leo Thorsness, Republican candidate for the United States Senate, will speak first. Leo?
Thank you very much, Leo. There's two of us here. I would like to start right into it. I would like to spend 7 minutes talking about agriculture. I'm of the opinion that if the farmer and rancher makes money in this state, we all make money. If the farmer and rancher goes broke, we all go broke. I think that's fact. I would like to just go through about 2 minutes of some basic statistics to sort of tie together my philosophy towards agriculture. A dozen years ago, 10 years ago, there were about a dozen countries that had a net export of agricultural products. Today we're basically down to 3, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and in order of importance of amount of export. We're becoming the food factory of the world. Since World War II, the population of the world has doubled. There are 75 million more people on the face of the earth every year. There are 1 out of every 7 people in the world today either starving to death or chronically underfed. On the other side of the coin, the United States and every industrialized nation, there are 13 basic materials we need. Things like bauxite, from which you get aluminum, zinc, gold, antimony, chromium, copper. Today we import half of those. It is estimated by 1983, 9 of those 13 will have to be imported. The reason I use those statistics or give those two sides, it just happens that most of the nations in the world that have these basic materials we must have and must import are hungry nations. Nations like East Africa, Latin America, South America, Mexico, and so on. My thought then is this, very basically said, the basic formula from which I would approach agriculture. We have what the world needs, food, and the world has what we need, these basic materials. So to put those two together, I have said I would like to see less government interference in telling individual farmers and ranchers how they're supposed to run their farms, how many acres of this or that to plant or not to plant, to set aside, things like production freezes, price controls, freezing beef. We're all still very familiar with that phase. In my opinion, anytime you interrupt the supply of supply and demand, interrupt that system, you only create problems, you don't solve them. You may hold them in abeyance a little while, you end up with more shortage than you started with, and so on. We all remember what the Arabs did with their oil. It's now about 400% higher than it was. Shortly after that happened, basically there are 4 nations in the world that have the supply of bauxite for aluminum. Jamaica, Suriname, Guinea are 3 of them. They got together, these nations did, and said, hey, look what the Arabs did with their oil. And since that time, the price of aluminum, bauxite ore, has gone up about 300%. These developing nations, these hungry nations, are feeling the importance of what they have, and probably justifiably so. It would be more complex than a farmer or a rancher at Pressler going to Suriname and say, hey, I've got wheat and you've got bauxite, but that's the basic theory. It would have to be done through an international monetary system. But I think it's a workable formula. What I'm saying is we do not have to give our food away. Let's go to those countries, let's develop those markets that have those things we have got to have and treat them as an equal trading partner. We've proven once again, or many, many times, that we can't buy friends. Let's help those nations to help themselves. They will help us. The demand for everything we can produce is here in the world. If it can be done through a free enterprise system, there's no doubt in my mind we can keep the prices up. Again, if the farmer or rancher makes money, we all make money. The good programs that we need to continue, the soil conservation, we got 100,000 stock ponds, an excellent program. Of course, they're dry now, but soil conservation, we're going to have a lot more energy if we're going to expand production, REA, these types of programs, research and development, those are governmental programs that we should have help with. I have proposed a 12-point agricultural program. Looking at the card, I have about 3 minutes left. I won't go into any detail on any of them, but very basically, so you know some specifics of that proposal and specifics of where I stand, I'll just read through very quickly several of those points that I included in there. First off, I do not want to see the government in control of our grain reserves. In my opinion, that held prices down in recent years drastically. We sort of got out of the reserve business, prices have gone up. I'm dead set against price control, production freezes. It'd have to be a very dire emergency. As of right now, as an example, absolutely not. That creates more problems than it solves. Beef grading system, I've been saying for quite some time, and I think they're talking about it now. It should be changed. When it's costing you 60 cents a pound to put on that last 400 pounds and you're selling it for 35, it doesn't take many smarts to figure out you're losing money. To get top price, you put that extra layer of fat on and then they throw it away in the other end. With better grades of beef, better feeding technique, the cost to feed, exotics, the crossbreeds and so on, that system was designed for Texas Longhorns. It should be changed. The beef that comes into this country, I say beef, I would include meat, dairy products, the whole works. It ought to meet our standards. Right now it isn't. Even though the agreement is there, we should enforce it. Trade, I think you firmly can realize, or certainly realize, I'm all for two-way trade. But that's two-way. Right now we're the dumping ground. That's completely wrong. It's time we go to our friendly trader partner and say, back off. You're more dependent on us than we are with you if I talk Canada or somewhere. We've got to stop being the dumping ground for beef in this country. Land use planning. My opponent and I feel very differently about this. I say that whatever county you're in, that county should have final authority to decide upon how you use your land, not federal government. I would like to see the United States Department of Agriculture return to the farmer and rancher. Today, 68% of their budget goes for welfare. I'm not discussing the value of welfare here, but as the food factory of the world, we better keep the funds that are designated for the farmer and rancher. I see my time is up. I have an agricultural program published. If anybody wants to see it, it's available for all to see, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Leo. Leo Thorsness, the Republican candidate for the United States Senate. And now, the incumbent United States Senator from South Dakota, the Honorable George McGovern.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hardig, Governor Kneip, Congressman Denholm, my distinguished opponent, Mr. Thorsness, President Radcliffe, and other candidates, members and guests of the Farmers Union. I want, first of all, this morning to heartily endorse the idea of these open forums that we've had for so many years through the courtesy of the Farmers Union. I think if we had more citizens' discussions of this kind that were open to questions and answers from the people and the candidates, it would reduce some of the slander, some of the cheap charges, some of the Watergate type of influence that has crept into our politics in recent years. And I want to applaud the Farmers Union not only for being informed on the issues, but not being satisfied with the battles that you've won in the past. Now, no member of the South Dakota Farmers Union has to be told that we have troubles on the farm, in our livestock industry, in our dairy production, in the various disaster programs, in all of those things that plague farmers today. And no farmer has to be told that he is one of the chief victims of inflation, of the cost of fuel, of the cost of machinery, of the cost of production at a time when the price the farmer receives is so uncertain. And as you all know too well, we have had to fight very hard in the Congress of the United States and through the influence of this organization just to save programs that we thought were safe. The Rural Electrification Program, which was almost killed by executive order in December of 1972. The Disaster Payment Program, Rural Conservation Programs, and even the basic price floor on our farm commodities. And most of all, we have had to fight against this silly notion that the farmer is the cause of inflation, when in fact, along with our senior citizens, he has been its chief victim. Now my opponent has suggested that we can solve these problems by simply developing better salesmen to sell our products overseas. He cited, for example, the case of Suriname, and has said that we ought to offer our food to Suriname in exchange for their bauxite. The trouble with a simple solution of that kind is that it overlooks the fact that Suriname is also a food exporting nation and is looking for places to sell their food surpluses. But I do not take a back seat to anyone in the development of overseas markets for our products. What disturbs me is that the President of the United States, who's in the best position to be a salesman for American agricultural exports, has recently intervened without warning to our farmers to halt a cash export sale of our grain, which can only have the effect of driving down the price of grain to the producers in this state. Now, I noticed that my opponent has asked for a private audience with Mr. Ford when he arrives in Sioux Falls tomorrow, and I hope in the course of that audience he will say to the President, after a year of administration refusal to halt the import of livestock and dairy products into this country that are breaking the prices to the producers in our state, we wish you wouldn't be quite so quick to halt a cash export that might mean a little more money in the pockets of our grain producers in this state. Over the years, I've enjoyed a partnership with the people of the Farmers Union, and it's a partnership that recognizes that we're not going to solve our problems by simple solutions suggesting that we simply get the government off the farm. What is much more to the point is to take whatever steps is necessary to make sure that the family farmer stays on the farm. And that's not going to happen without a sympathetic and responsive government that recognizes the terrible danger to our way of life if corporate agriculture replaces the family farm. We need a partnership that seeks a total overall food policy, and one that recognizes that feeding people, both at home and abroad, is in both the self-interest and the humanitarian interest of the farm producers of this country. I've read these proposals recently that we ought to transfer all of our food assistance programs into the welfare department on some strange theory that that's going to reduce the cost. It won't reduce the cost. The programs will still cost equally as much. What it will do is make it impossible for us ever again to pass a good farm bill in the Congress of the United States. The way we are enabled to get city votes, particularly in the House of Representatives for a farm bill, is because the Department of Agriculture budget includes the school lunch program and Food for Peace and food stamps and assistance to the elderly in these hot lunch programs. And I want to warn here today, with all the conviction at my command, that if we were to bow to this suggestion by my opponent that all of these food programs be taken out of the Department of Agriculture and shifted over to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, I'm convinced we could not pass any kind of a substantial farm program or REA program for the people of this country. We must not permit that to happen. Let me just conclude on this note. Farmers and consumers alike have an interest in a strong and healthy agricultural economy. If we do not take steps now to put a halt to inflation that is driving people to the wall on the farm, if we do not take steps to roll back these unconscionable increases in oil prices that are breaking our producers on the farm, in the long run, that is a threat to every American. Thank you so much for this chance to speak briefly this morning.
Thank you, Senator McGovern. We will hear next from the gubernatorial candidates from South Dakota, and once again, they have been chosen by lot. To speak first is Governor Richard Kneip.
Thank you very much, Leo, and thank you, the representatives and people of the Farmers Union here in South Dakota, for giving us this opportunity of providing a forum through which we can address ourselves to the issues. You're to be complimented on that. And I'll get quickly into some thoughts I have. And since the time that the homesteaders first came to South Dakota, the family farm has shaped the character of life in this state. No other single institution has done more to build our towns, finance our schools, raise our young people, and mold our view of the world and our attitude towards our fellow man than the family farm. Those who have resided on the family farm unit have made all of these contributions and more, while at the same time making the family farm the most efficient producer of food the world has ever known. The family farm has made these contributions while enduring extensive hardships. The South Dakota farmer and rancher faces unpredictable weather and an unfair marketplace in which those from whom he buys and those to whom he sells set the prices and set the terms of trade. He faces a federal government that alternately hurts and helps him, and the South Dakota farmer and rancher faces as well a property tax system that places a cruel and unreasonable burden on his means of living. While these hardships have contributed to reducing the number of farms and ranches, the family farm has endured as an institution because the people on the land believe in agriculture not as a business, but as a way of life. Our family farmers and ranchers have virtually defied the technological experts who periodically and prematurely predict the death of the family farm, and have instead continued it as the foundation of agricultural and rural life in America. It is my belief that the state of South Dakota should match the will and determination of our family farmers and ranchers. Our goal should be to ensure that the family farm not only endures, but prospers and receives its just rewards for the contributions it makes to the life of this state and nation. We should use every means at our disposal to attain this goal. Yet at the same time, we must realistically recognize that some of the most important methods for achieving this goal can be exercised only by the federal government. Only the federal government can stabilize national agricultural markets or correct the excessive concentration of power in those industries that sell to or buy from the farmer. And only the federal government can decide to give us the flexibility to reshape its economic and social programs to work in rural areas. It is for this reason that I support the upward adjustment of federal target prices for agricultural products to realistically reflect inflated costs of production. I support as well vigorous investigation into and subsequent actions to correct concentrations of market power that harm our farmer and rancher. And I support the full implementation of the Rural Development Act to revitalize our rural communities. While our resources are often limited, vigorous efforts are being taken at the state level to strengthen family farming in South Dakota. When I came into office, the Department of Agriculture was a small regulatory agency. In 4 years, we have doubled its budget. We have reorganized into that department 5 previously separate agricultural agencies. Most importantly, we have established a new focus in that department on agricultural marketing and development. One small example of that new focus is the Market News Service, now provided by that department. In 1974, with the vital support of this union, the Farmers Union, the Family Farm Act was passed, and now limits inappropriate corporate activity in South Dakota agriculture. This achievement was especially interesting to me since I was the first one to sponsor that legislation on behalf of the Farmers Union some years ago. Through the Old West Regional Commission, which I chair, South Dakota is presently joining with 4 other states in a $450,000 international marketing program for agricultural products. Of special significance in the past 4 years has been our efforts in resource development and conservation. The Water Resource Management Act became law, and we authorized the first irrigation project under that system in the 1974 legislature. Also in 1974, at the initiative of a Democratic legislator, $1 million was invested in the development of rural water systems. The Weather Modification Program has become operational and even expanded. Funds were appropriated as well in 1974 for local soil conservation work. To enhance the quality of rural life, we have implemented the Model Rural Development Program to give even the smallest communities the opportunity to plan and shape their own futures. Finally, we have begun an effort that, to our knowledge, is the only one of its kind in the Midwest, and through a bipartisan Council on the Future of Agriculture, we will chart in a very careful way a broad and innovative future course for state government with respect to agriculture. We think that's an honest approach and not just a hit and miss and shoot them down attitude that I've seen when we look to agricultural problems as I've watched them over the years. We have begun these efforts together, and they are working. But I would be the first person to say that more needs to be done if we are to attain the goals of prosperous family farms and vigorous rural communities. There is no step that state government can take today that will do more to help the family farm than the adoption of an equitable tax system. I am the only governor in 4 decades who has presented to the legislature comprehensive tax reform proposals. In 4 decades, the only governor to take that step. 3 times I have presented such programs, and I will again in 1975 ask the legislature as I did in 1972. I'll ask questions like, how many farmers are we going to drive from the land? Or how many older Americans are we going to drive from their homes before we put an end to a cruel and an immoral tax structure? Ladies and gentlemen, there are many things that I would like to say to you today, and 7 minutes is a short time. And I dislike reading off lists or categorically some accomplishments and recognizing hopefully all the time failures. Certainly I've failed in the sense of bringing an equitable tax structure to our state. But I won't stand before you at election time and make wild promises to you that I can't keep. I've tried in a very serious and deliberate and direct way to face each and every one of these issues, and I believe sincerely that in facing them and trying to deal with them in a direct and honest way that we can overcome some of these problems that we face as a state. It's in that sense that I sincerely believe we can build a better South Dakota and a better United States. Thank you.
Sorry that keeps falling all the time. Thank you, Governor Kneip. And now, from the Republican side, John Olson, gubernatorial candidate.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's very interesting to return to this meeting as a participant in this panel rather than someone sitting in the audience. And I want to tell you that I do applaud your efforts in this direction so that we exchange ideas before you. And of course, that is the reason we're here. As a businessman, as a former director of the Department of Highways, As a former executive secretary of the South Dakota Rural Electric Association, I want to tell you that there are many things with which I agree on which I agree with our current governor. However, there are a great many things in which I disagree, and one of them is the philosophy that he touched on relative to preserving the family farm. You can slice that melon any way you want, and if there isn't a profit in operating that family farm, what in the world good does it do to stand here and talk about it? I've been hearing this lip service now for 4 years. I haven't seen one constructive thing done in the area of marketing that reflects to me the effort on the part of the State Department of Agriculture to do one thing about it. When this current administration came to power, we had on the staff of the Department of Agriculture a man who was extremely well grounded in the area of marketing. And he disappeared from the scene. A man by the name of Ted Holtgrew. And to my knowledge, there's no one on the staff of that department to this date who has the same contacts nationally and internationally that Ted Holtgrew had or anyone of his stature. We have all the expertise at the university in Brookings. We have the expertise in the economics department at the university in Vermilion. We have knowledge in the area of production. We have knowledge in the area of the control of herbicides and pesticides. We have demonstrated that the diagnostic center at the university in Brookings can save us millions of dollars by immediate diagnosis of problems in the agricultural area, and yet, to my knowledge, we haven't done one constructive thing in trying to influence the marketing of agricultural products but to talk about it. And so I have pledged to you since the first day I started on this campaign that if I become the governor of this state, the secretary of that department will be an outstanding spokesman for agriculture, and that will be his primary job. In addition to that, he will be supplied with at least one and hopefully more people who have demonstrated that they are knowledgeable in the area of marketing, and they will go out and actually contact markets in an effort to convince the public that we have the best agricultural products in the world. And that department will work in close harmony with IDEA to develop agribusiness products that can process our agricultural products in the state of South Dakota and not pay the tremendous prices we're paying for transporting some of our commodities into the market stream at the present time. When I go back to the family farm philosophy, I love it. I lived on one, I worked on one from the time I was big enough to chase a team of horses up and down a corn row until I finished college. But I have never seen one of them exist that didn't make a profit. And so let's quit kidding one another. Let's talk about how we get those products into the market stream at the best possible price. And if 73 didn't convince you of what's important to the state of South Dakota, nothing ever will, because the great volumes of dollars that came flooding into the state when we had high farm prices was the greatest boon to this state that I've ever seen. In addition to that, I want to say that as far as I'm concerned, the next effort must be in the area of controlling inflation and in complete cooperation with a curb on the inflationary spiral of the spending in state government and the federal government level. During the current administration, the budget has gone from $86 million a year to $133 million a year. And in our opinion, that has far exceeded the inflationary spiral that you've seen nationally and therefore has contributed to inflation as much as the federal government, if not more. And we have pledged to you that if we are elected, we will place a ceiling on that budget until we've taken a hard look at every program that exists. It must start with the government and all of us working together if we're going to curb the inflationary trend that we have seen continue throughout the present administration and the continuing spiral in prices that has resulted therefrom. In addition to that, we want to call to your attention the fact that we have continuously made the statement that we will move to bring government closer to you as the people of the state of South Dakota. And that every other Saturday, we will be out somewhere in the state holding what we'll call a People's Day to come closer to you as the people of the state of South Dakota to learn what you want done at the state level and to tell you what we think are important. In our opinion, that's not asking too much of the chief administrator of the state of South Dakota to ask him to come out and meet with you at least every other Saturday of the year. And in addition, we'll have one day a month when you will be able to see the governor without an appointment if you're in fear and want to sweat it out. In an effort to move the government closer to you and for you to get through the maze of bureaucracy which has been created through the implementation of the reorganization of the executive branch of government. In addition to that, we have pledged that we will work in the area of tax reform in the state of South Dakota by calling for an immediate meeting between the administrative branch and the leadership of the two tax committees of the House and the Senate in an effort to resolve the problems that the governor has talked about for 4 years, and it's right where it was when he came to office. Because in our opinion, he has run in one direction and allowed the legislature to go in the other direction, so the resulting clash during the legislative session has resulted in politics rather than a solution to a people's problem. And it's our contention that this is a people's problem and it must be solved between sessions, not during sessions, and we'll seek to do that by asking for complete cooperation with the legislature in meetings with the leadership between the legislative sessions as an attempt to solve this without the aura of politics surrounding it, as has resulted in each of the years when he has finally submitted a bill late in the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Olson. And now, I'm sure that many questions have occurred to you individually that you would like to ask of the candidates. The pages will begin now going up and down the aisles. If you just raise your hand, they'll bring the questions forward so that they can be asked of the individual candidates at the conclusion of the prepared statements by the candidates themselves. We will move now to the candidates for 1st District Congress from South Dakota. And once again, the flip of the coin determined the first speaker to be incumbent Congressman Frank Denholm.
Thank you very much, Leo. Senator George McGovern, Governor Kneip, my fellow candidates, delegates and members and friends of the South Dakota Farmers Union. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to be with you today and to talk for 7 minutes about the problems of our time. I want to talk to them in a general way. I find it difficult to campaign as an incumbent. I think it's essential that we use this time to report to the people and to project some ideas as possible solutions to the problems of our time. I know when I was a boy, I attended a convention like this downtown in the hotel, probably only about a fourth as many people, but twice as crowded. And a fellow came there by the name of M.W. Thatcher, whom some of you may well recall. He said on that occasion that farm prices are made in Washington, and I've never forgotten it. Farm prices are made in Washington because of what is done and what is not done. And what is not done sometimes is more important than what is done as far as making farm prices. My former colleague and the distinguished gentleman that now is President of the United States said to the American people when he took that office that the United States and the people of this great country have survived a nightmare. Believe me, we have survived a nightmare. Slightly more than a year ago, the Vice President of the United States resigned. And since that time, we've gone through a Vice President, a President, and back to a Vice President, while the loyal party of opposition wants to blame the Congress for all that is not done, and some for all that is done. I say to you that if you know the rise and fall of governments in history, that where there is political instability, it is followed by economic chaos. And I think the facts speak for themselves, that our system of government has survived the test of political instability. Richard Nixon was the last of the leaders of the Western world to fall. I could say West Germany and Spain and Portugal and France and England and Canada and South America and the rest of them. He fell by his own making. He resigned himself from his office. But we, the people, suffered that political instability, and it was followed by economic chaos, a situation that developed a price level for producers on a roller coaster market structure. There have been illusions here today about marketing and transportation. We've had those problems for years. But under our system of government, when we have that kind of political instability, which certainly the Congress could not have been blamed for, and certainly the incumbent candidates in this election knew nothing about, and I might say that my opponent has talked about making some farmer Secretary of Agriculture. Quite frankly, I know a lot of farmers. I don't dislike any of them well enough to make my friends a Secretary of Agriculture. I say that the people of South Dakota and the people of America could have done a lot better if they'd have made a South Dakota president in 1972. So I'd say to my worthy opponent, he should have been supporting us then, instead of talking about making some good friend of mine, the Secretary of Agriculture, to be bled to death on this terrible mess that we've got. And when you have this political instability followed by this economic chaos in our system, that begets the very worst thing that can happen to us, the concentration of economic power. And I'll cite just a few cases to tell you what you've paid for. It happened in the fuel industry, the fertilizer industry, and in the food industry. And it's still happening. And with the coming of Jerry Ford, when he addressed the joint session of the Congress, I thought there was a new hope, that at last we had a man that would execute in good faith the public law of this land, and that agencies of this government would begin to act in the interest of the governed. And if they don't, we're going to have some more of what we've had. I'm perfectly willing to work with the President to see that the agencies of government do it. The Congress does not execute and carry out the law. It makes the law and the policy of the land. It's up to the executive branch of government to execute that law. And we must have the antitrust division of the State Department execute and carry out the law to break up the concentration of economic power that is destroying our farm families, that is literally robbing you. It's going on in the meat industry today while the President sits on the law and won't shut off imports for dairy and livestock people. I proposed an agriculture policy in the fall of 1972 and introduced it in August. That same policy was picked up, and part of it was become public law under the concept of the target prices. You've all heard me speak on it before. I proposed in that same measure the 7% investment tax credit, which is public law and has been public law since 1971. Now, there's much more to be done. We've accomplished a lot. I don't have to tell you how we struggled to try to keep the REA program. When we were at the threshold of what has been alleged to be an energy crisis, we had leadership in the office of President and Secretary of Agriculture that terminated public law that had been law for 37 years. For 4.5 months, I fought that battle with more than 127 of my colleagues as co-sponsors of the bill to try to reinstate a source of energy for the production of food and fiber. Constantly, the administration opposed us on it. I want to say to you, and I have 1 minute left, that when I went to conference and met the man from the Senate, he was George McGovern. And South Dakota is one of those rare states that has, on the conference committee, a member of the House and a member of the Senate. And the biggest single mistake that the people of South Dakota can make in 1974, unless I'm all wrong, if you can perceive in your minds that you will have a Republican-dominated Congress in 1975 and 76, then you should vote Republicans. Because otherwise they're going to be on the minority side and they're going to be zilch as far as getting anything done for South Dakota. The best possible thing that the people of South Dakota can do in 1974 is to elect the people that have led. Because I say to you, I have not been able to accomplish all of the things that I sought to do when I went to the Congress. Many I have done in 2 short terms. But I'll say this, that if the leadership of the Congress is not with you, if Tip O'Neill and Carl Albert and Peter Rodino and these men that hold the positions of leadership in the Congress are not on my side, I pray God how anybody else is going to move anything through that Congress. And so this year, 1974, the best single thing you can do for South Dakota is keep men like George McGovern in the Senate of the United States and Frank Denholm in the United States Congress.
Thank you, Congressman Denholm. And now his Republican challenger for the 1st District Congressional seat, Mr. Larry Pressler.
Thank you very much. I've been at Farmers Union meetings before, coming from a family farm where my father is a lifetime member of Farmers Union. I guess as growing up, I've been to about every Farmers Union camp that a young person could go to. I'm glad to see this morning some members of Green Thumb here. That's a project which I've been advocating that we expand a great deal, and I enjoyed the earlier speaker this morning. I think one distinction between my opponent and I is in terms of priorities in government spending, and I have spoken out strongly for cuts in our wasteful military spending, which he has voted for consistently. And I think that Green Thumb is going to be a project that's the sort of thing we should be investing in human resources, instead of pouring money, $17 billion a year, into European defenses, which our NATO allies, of which 2 now have a higher per capita income than we do. I just think it's time that we redirect our priorities, and I was so glad to hear the speech on Green Thumb this morning. I guess when one comes to a Farmers Union meeting or an REA meeting as a Republican, people say, well, they're all Democrats, but that's not true. Witness my family. And certainly the founder of REA, George Norris of Nebraska, a great United States senator, was a Republican. So I think that you need a viable alternative, and I think that we need to bring some energy back into the agricultural, political, competitive situation. As my opponent mentioned, in August, I called on Secretary Ford to replace Secretary Butz, mainly because of his conduct of the common market negotiations, in which Secretary Butz agreed that the common market would import no red meat and we would import some of their red meat. And I called on the president to appoint the first family farmer to that post, and I gave him a list of names of some of my neighbors who had the basic family farm philosophy that the Department of Agriculture needs, and it's never had. We've never had a family farmer as Secretary of Agriculture, and I think that this convention should send President Ford a resolution tomorrow when he's in Sioux Falls urging him to replace Secretary Butz with a family farmer and suggest some names. I also feel that there are 2 or 3 main points on agriculture that I want to touch on in this brief time. The first one is reform in Congress, particularly in the House Agricultural Committee. In the aftermath of Watergate, I've been talking a good deal about reform. As you well know, I was the first South Dakota political figure on April 13th to say that I would vote for President Richard Nixon's impeachment. And I got through the Republican primary with that position because a lot of grassroots Republicans feel strongly the need to bring government back to the people. And I've spoken out strongly for reform in our government. The real challenge now is who's going to do something to prevent Watergate from happening again. And I want to turn to a committee in the House of Representatives that affects every person in this room, and that's the House Agricultural Committee, on which my opponent serves and on which I would seek to serve. That committee is the most junketing committee in Congress. Its members, and it's probably the least effective, it's frequently been called the least effective member, the least effective committee in the entire House of Representatives. Some of you may have read Jack Anderson last Saturday, when my opponent and some other members of the House Agricultural Committee were cited for taking an illegal gift in violation of the U.S. Constitution of a gift to Venezuela, and also a plush party and so forth, which is in violation of the U.S. Constitution and also of the Free Foreign Gifts Acts of 1966. Venezuela did get a cozy wheat deal from us, but in turn, they're giving us a cozy oil deal now, which is increasing our oil prices, threatening to nationalize our oil companies, and when you're paying your fuel bill, think of that. But the very first thing that I learned when I went into work in the State Department is that you cannot accept gifts from foreign governments when you're abroad. And that's a fundamental principle, and it should apply to congressmen as well as everybody else. And certainly the House Agricultural Committee. My opponent has been cited by Jack Anderson twice in the last few years. The first time for taking a plane ride from an agribusiness group, and the second time for taking a free gift from a foreign government in violation of our Constitution. I just think that farmers, when I see how hard my dad has worked on his 160-acre farm and how little he's gotten from it, we've just got to have better representation on the House Agricultural Committee. The House Agricultural Committee spends the majority of its time holding hearings on what the Department of Agriculture has already done, or the White House. And one reason that I wanted to run for Congress is because I disagreed so strongly with the way certain things in the executive branch of government were being done. I want to go on by touching on some issues I've been talking a great deal about. I support a floor under cattle prices. There are a lot of people who talk about free agriculture, but the other day I was up at Loken Sale Barn in Watertown, and I saw Hereford heifers selling for $22 per hundredweight. And we're killing off a whole industry we're killing off the cattle industry in the sense that it takes 5 to 7 years to rebuild it. And I think that we should preserve that industry. I'd also like to point out that the Target Price Program, which my opponent claimed to be the sponsor of, was actually originally sponsored by Milton Young of North Dakota. And there are close to probably over 100 co-sponsors in both houses of that bill. And I support that bill wholeheartedly. I would expand it to cattle prices. I believe strongly in family farming and the moral fiber that it gives our country, and I think we've got to work to preserve it. And we can't accept the argument that just because someone is a Republican, he's not fighting for it. I also think that the interest rate problem, Congress, particularly the House Agricultural Committee, has been standing around with its hands in its pocket while an interest crisis is building in South Dakota. By next spring, our interest rate will be 14 or 15%, and that violates the usury law of South Dakota of 10%. I just think we need rollbacks in the interest rates, and I think that our President and our Congress in particular should do something about it. I'd like to say a few words on the international arena. I think that many of the gains that farmers may fight to gain domestically will be lost on the international markets in the coming year unless we are careful. I was in the State Department under Dr. Kissinger for 2 years, as some of you may know. And one of the reasons I'm running for Congress is because I disagree so strongly with the way we conduct our foreign policy, whether it's our congressmen taking gifts from foreign governments or whether it's embargo on grain agreements. We've got to get more farmers on international delegations. I attended meetings in Geneva at which there were large agribusiness representation on delegations, on the International Wheat Agreement, the International Grains Agreement, and the International Agreement on Trade and Tariff. And I believe it's time that we insist that family farmers are on those delegations, and if I'm set to Congress, I certainly will. I believe very strongly in the concept, and indeed I get a lot of advice from Ken Stoffren, my chairman, whom some of you may know. I believe very strongly in the concept of farm state congressmen holding a press conference every Monday on the difference in prices between what farmers receive and what consumers pay. I think that farmers and consumers should work together to find out what's going on in the agribusiness industry and why it is that our congressmen on the House Agricultural Committee are in such a cozy relationship with them. I see I've overtalked my time. I've got about halfway through my notes, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry Pressler. If you have any further questions to address to members of the panel, the pages will be very happy to pick them up, because immediately following the next two speakers, we will go to the question and answer period of our program, in which each of the candidates will have questions addressed to him, will be allowed 3 minutes to address himself to that question, and then his opponent in that given race will have the opportunity to make an equal 3-minute rebuttal if he so desires. And now we move to the 2nd District congressional race, and by lot, once again, the first speaker chosen, Mr. Jack Weiland.
Thank you very much. Officers, delegates, members, guests, and panelists, I certainly appreciate this opportunity to appear here and take part in what I consider to be an exercise in the democratic process. I'm also very happy to note that you had Jerry Werf here yesterday, who spoke to you about some of the problems of the working people in the cities. I want to commend the Farmers Union for bringing this caliber of people in here, because it's in the urban areas that we must have understanding. If any of the programs that affect family farmers are going to be passed, it's a selling job that must be done with the urban congressman. I support the concept of the family farm. And this morning I want to give you my positions in 4 areas directly related to family farming. I support higher target prices in the 1973 law. I support a food reserve for the people. I support the Young Farmer Investment Act. And I support antitrust action that is victimizing not only the farmers, but also the consumers of this nation. Going back to target prices, I think that any target price that is set certainly must reflect the cost of production. The target prices that were set in 1973 were set at 70% of parity. This has now declined to 50% of parity, which is less than the cost of production. I note that the Republican administration has been calling for all-out production without any protection whatsoever. And we've seen what's happened in the beef and the dairy industry. I would support prices at 90% of parity in the dairy industry. A food reserve. I definitely support a food reserve for the people of this country. I also support American exports. And incidentally, had we had a food reserve and been carrying it recently, the public outcry would not have stopped the export sale of commodities to Russia. Every time that we try to engage in international trade with our farm products, there has to be support by the urban people. A food reserve would bring this. U.S. farmers accounted for 45% of the wheat and 60% of the feed grain moving in world trade. And we should continue to take advantage of the export markets that we have in the world. During the first 5 months of 1974, we imported 734 million pounds of foreign meat, and dairy imports increased 183% over the last year. And we see now what's happening to those segments of agriculture that are being affected. I think that we should limit imports. I think that we have the power by this president and by Mr. Butts to do this. And it seems strange to me that we cancel the export sales of wheat and corn and turn around and let America be the dumping ground for the imports of beef and dairy products. I support the Young Farmer Investment Act. Certainly all of us know the average age of the farmers in South Dakota is 57 years old. I support the concept of allowing and encouraging young farmers to go into agriculture, because certainly the consumer's future is very dependent on the family farmers. Antitrust action, we've had laws on the books, but we've had very few antitrust actions taken by this government. Just recently, a $32 million suit was won by beef producers against a very large food chain for restraint of trade. Now, why do individual groups have to initiate these measures when the laws are on the books already to protect the people? Where is our antitrust department? What are they doing? They didn't do anything about gasoline prices, and they're not doing anything about the tremendous conglomerate entry into the agricultural industry. I also support a Family Farm Act that would simply be an extension of our antitrust laws to keep the conglomerates from moving into the agricultural field. I think that it's very important that you know my position on some of these very basic issues. Again, I support higher target prices in the 1973 Farm Law. I support a national food reserve that will guarantee participation in world and international commerce in farm produce. I support the Young Farmer Investment Act, and I support new legislation and tougher legislation to keep the family farmer independent and on the land. I thank you very much for this opportunity to express my views.
Thank you, Mr. Jack Weiland. And now here to speak for 2nd District Congressman James Abdnor is his assistant, Mr. Owen Amber.
Thank you, Leo. Good morning, Farmers Union members, ladies and gentlemen. After hearing the remarks of the distinguished candidates who have preceded me, I'm sure the last thing you need is a long dissertation from me. But I have a distinct advantage over some of those who are before you this morning. That advantage means that I don't have to make a long speech about Jim Abdnor, his record, his views on the issues, his hopes for the future of South Dakota and rural America. The advantage I hold is that you know Jim Abdnor. You know his distinguished record in state government as lieutenant governor and as a state senator who was continually reelected by his friends and neighbors who know him best and remain his strongest and most loyal supporters. You know of Jim's untiring dedication to the job of representing the interests of the good people of the 2nd District of South Dakota in a Washington environment which is far removed and often hostile to the needs of rural America. You know that although it is impossible to please everyone, Jim Abdnor thinks each individual's thoughts are important, and you know that he's willing to listen. And you know that when Jim comes before you as your congressman or as a candidate for re-election, he comes before you as one of you, a bona fide member of the great Farmers Union organization of long-standing and a seat of the pants, dirt under the fingernails farmer himself, who has owed his livelihood to farming until he was elected to Congress and became a full-time representative of the most agricultural state in America. You may know that he is the first and only farmer South Dakota has ever sent to Washington. And believe me, there are plenty of people in Washington